Have you ever wondered if there's something you're missing when it comes to trying to connect with an avoidant attachment style? Well, there tends to be a few specific things that actually motivate a dismissive avoidant to want to deeply connect with somebody else, despite all of their relationship fears. And in today's video, I am going to break down exactly what those things are that motivate a dismissive avoidant to want to truly connect with somebody else. First thing is first, common characteristics of the dismissive avoidant attachment style. So things that you want to keep in mind that are part of their comfort zone for how they're naturally going to best connect. DAs first and foremost tend to be logical and rational. Okay. So when you're trying to, for example, communicate about your feelings, it doesn't mean don't communicate your feelings. It means communicate your feelings in a logical and rational way, in a way that they are likely to best hear your feelings. So if you go to a DA and you're really emotional and you say, oh my gosh, I'm so hurt, and you're expressing in a really intense emotional way, because that's so far outside of the dismissive avoidance subconscious comfort zone, and because that's not something they're used to, this is usually going to be where they kind of like pull back or they distance themselves because it feels unfamiliar, and they usually don't know how to handle those situations as easily until they've started to do some work on themselves, right? And to understand some of these things more deeply. So when you're communicating your emotions, just do it in a logical, rational way, right? If I go to a dismissive avoidant and I'm like really emotional and I'm pacing and my whole like nervous system dynamic is really thrown off, then that information is not going to land as well as if I go to a dismissive avoidant and I say, hey, you know what? I want to hash out a conversation from the other day. You know, when situation X happened, I experienced it as feeling, misunderstood. And really in the future, I need some more understanding by you like being more present with me and then asking me questions. Can we practice that in the future? Can you commit to that with me? That would help the relationship a lot from my end. If I communicate that way, I'm communicating in a logical, rational way. It's better going to land with your dismissive avoidant loved one. So it's a really important thing to keep in mind. Dismissive avoidance as well. It depends on like the context of the relationship, but if you're just meeting them, if it's a newer relationship, they're almost always slower to warm up when you first spend time with them. So like maybe you're on a first date, a second date, a third date, you'll usually find that like, 15, 20 minutes, half an hour into the date, 45 minutes into the date, it's like they finally let their guard down. It's not the case for every DA. And obviously it starts to change as you spend more and more time with that person, but they may seem at first like they kind of have their guard up, and it's because they do, but it's not because you're doing something wrong. It's because that's the way that they feel about human interaction sometimes because of their own individual subconscious programming. But part of building rapport is always meeting somebody where they're at, right? Like if one person's a little guarded when you first interact with them, and let's say you're an AP, for example, and you're the opposite, you're super friendly and super kind and super open. If you can tell somebody's a little guarded, like, and you go in hot, like you go in, 100 out of 100, you're going to see that your dismissive avoidant loved one might feel it will only ever highlight to them how much different they feel from you. And it will usually cause them to put their guard up even more. So it's not that like you have to change yourself or do anything differently, but you can be considerate of where somebody else is coming from, right? So you could know, they take a little while to warm up. I'll keep things more surface and high level, and I'll be maybe less physically affectionate or touchy-feely immediately. Like I'll kind of respect that they just need a little space at the beginning of interactions to feel safe. Again, this may not apply if you're like living with your spouse. It's going to be a little bit of a different situation once you're past a certain degree of comfort. But if you're dating somebody, and it's a few months in, it's more fresh. If you spent some time without seeing the person and then you're reconnecting and coming back together, like in a long distance relationship, I see this come up a lot. And even sometimes to a certain degree, dismissive avoidance when they are living with people, sometimes first thing in the morning, they need a little bit of their kind of space for a moment as well. And if there's this like coming in hot first thing in the morning, there can be these sorts of dynamics that take place too. Again, the goal here is not to be like, let me write all the, like, it's good to take notes if you want to learn, but don't write all the notes and then change who you are. It's just knowing like, hey, if somebody's over here and I'm over here, we're going to meet in the middle sometimes. Like I can be mindful of their needs. And also I can tell them where I'm coming from and what I need as well. And we can bridge that gap together. The cool thing about this is when we do the how to connect deeply with each attachment style and we do practice bridging those gaps, Usually exactly the gaps we need to bridge actually really impact our own healing journey at the same time, which is so interesting because like as an AP, maybe sometimes taking a step back, if you're with a DA and not coming in so hot all the time also helps you to kind of like stay in your body, like stay grounded, stay like in relationship to yourself, your own feelings, your own needs. It actually like gives you space to better form a healthy relationship to self. Just as a dismissive avoidant, when they have to kind of come halfway and be more open and more warm and more considerate, it also empowers them to grow, right? It also empowers them to like get more in touch with their feelings, become more expressive, soothe through others a little bit more, which is a really nice experience once we feel comfortable doing it. And so both compromises we need to make usually end up just feeding directly into the highest expression of ourselves as individuals also. Um, okay, another couple things is dismissive avoidance when you're asking them for something, they generally want to see that there's a practical reason for this. So like if you ask for something and you don't seem to have some kind of like practical reasoning behind it, they may not want to commit to that. They generally like practical gifts. They generally like practical commitments. They generally like to see that there's a practical side to why you're doing what you're doing. And that tends to be a thing that sort of is very much in their subconscious comfort zone. They usually don't do a lot of things in their own personal lives that are impractical. And again, it doesn't mean that we can only ever do these things, but it's just interesting to sort of take into consideration. Obviously, dismissive avoidants do need space and time to recharge alone. They do value their independence. Again, these do not have to be, even though they seem different, even though they seem at opposite ends. Again, if you're a more anxious leaning person in here, FA leaning AP or SA with a little bit of AP, what ends up happening is, it doesn't have to be like, oh, so they want more space. So now the relationship has to be like two ships passing in the night and you can only ever have space in the relationship. That's not how this is supposed to go. What ends up happening is that you can have really strong, good quality time where when you're together, phones away, good habits, like present with each other, communicating, you can have quality time and you can have time that's like quality time to yourselves. So just knowing that that person may need some time to recharge alone. It shouldn't be like the relationship ends up that you never see each other. It should be that you see each other frequently. And when you do, you're deeply connected, you're present, you set those goals. And you also know that, hey, maybe, for example, if you're dating somebody for 6 months, they may not want to spend the whole weekend together. They may want to spend Friday night and Saturday night and do their own thing Sunday, right? And just making space for like both of those things, having open dialogue about them is really important. And just for the record too, it's not because a dismissive avoidant is sitting there going, oh, I don't care to see you. You're not important enough. It's not that at all. It's simply that dismissive avoidants generally come from the space of they're not the best at co-regulating yet. We've done other webinars about co-regulation. And until they get good at that, they usually only really know how to recharge in their spare time. In their alone time. So knowing that, like, so for example, like I remember I had a dismissive avoidant roommate in college and university, and I remember, like, I just knew about her, like she was like one of my closest friends as well at the time, and I knew that she needed space sometimes. So I would just like ask her sometimes, because sometimes I like go into her room to chat and I could tell, and I'd be like, oh, do you need space? And she'd be like, yeah, I do. And then I'd be like, okay, and I'll see you later. And I like knew, right? Like I could sort of understand. And that really helped our relationship. Like I could tell that she like really appreciated that I just kind of understood that about her. And like my husband and I we both like recharge alone and recharge together. But sometimes when like we have no time alone, we'll talk about it. Like I'll be like, hey, I just need space for half an hour. And then let's like connect and hang out before bed, or, things like that. And like when that's normalized, that being able to have a conversation about that, and he's like that too. Like if he's ever busy or focused or whatever, like, oh, do you need space right now? And he'll just say, yeah, I need a little bit of space, but I'll come chat with you in a little bit. And like it's just, as soon as that's normalized, it's so healthy, right? Because it's like you can have space and connection. They're not mutually exclusive things. That tends to be a big thing. And then one other big characteristic to take into consideration for the DA is that they tend to as well, they can get in a space where they are like so used to repressing their emotions, again, especially before they've like done the work to become secure, that, and I can look back. I really realized this through working with clients, but I can look back on times that I had friends who were dismissive avoidant growing up, and that I would like ask them a lot about their feelings because I always like to talk about feelings and their experiences. And I could tell they like kind of would shut down or not really have an answer. And then you kind of keep poking. And I was like, oh, like they just, they're holding back. Like I'm going to get them to open up or, thinking from that space. But sometimes people actually just need to open up on their own time. So again, if you have a loved one and you're like, but how do you feel about this? Or like, what are you feeling? And you're asking and asking, sometimes like they don't know. And so when you keep asking something to somebody that they don't really know or they're not in touch with, it can just make them feel like closed down or frustrated or I can see that Susie understands. And so, just being mindful and considerate of that is always a really great thing to pay attention to. And it doesn't mean, again, just to be super clear, I'll probably repeat this a lot throughout today's presentation, but it doesn't mean that you're not allowed to talk to this person about their feelings. Like if you're in a relationship with somebody, you should be having discussions about feelings. It just means that like, don't poke too much too soon, too frequently, or if they especially say like, I'm not sure, or, and then you can just say, you know what, I'm interested. And so if you reflect on it and have a good answer for me later, I'd love to hear about it, right? You can just sort of park it, let it be, let them come back to it. And generally what I find is that because I would work with a lot of couples on these sorts of things, when somebody feels like you're asking the questions, but not pressuring them for an answer, or an immediate answer or, that kind of stuff, they generally do think about it. And then they generally come back with some information for you kind of on their own time. So usually when we can respect that space, it actually like works much more effectively as well. Just a quick reminder, it is the new year and we are offering something super special, which I'm so excited to share with you. It is not only a free 7-day trial to all of the personal development school, but this time there's something different. And that is that you will get to keep the relationship needs course for life just for coming in and checking out the school for free to begin with. This needs course is incredibly helpful when it comes to you discovering who you truly are, what you really need in relationships, and what it is that your loved ones are also secretly looking for. Again, you'll get to keep this course for free for life, along with access to the 7-day trial. This is something we've never done before and may never do again. So make sure you take advantage of this opportunity now while we have it available for a limited time. The last big thing in terms of characteristics to pay attention to is that dismissive avoidants really don't like to feel pressured, but that is not the same thing as not liking to meet people's needs. So one thing I found time and time and time and time again is that dismissive avoidance, if you communicate, especially if you start off slow with smaller things and you kind of build up over time, if you communicate what you need from them really clearly, really specifically, start with small things. And then when they do make an effort, acknowledge and appreciate this, like dismissive ones are actually really good at trying to meet needs for other people in relationships. I've always seen like working with couples, surprisingly big like leaps and bounds in a pretty short period of time. Now, if we get the how to communicate wrong, it has the reverse effect. So if we, communicate and then we pressure and we're like, it has to be right now, they'll rebel. They'll feel this like rebellious nature. Like, I don't have to do that. But if you're like, hey, when we hang out and eat dinner together, I notice that sometimes we're like on our phones or the television's on. Can we put our phones away for the first, half hour and just be really present and try to talk about each other's day? And listen, like if you're ever having a really bad day and you're burnt out and tired, like we'll flip the TV on over dinner. It doesn't have to be forever and always, but can we work towards that? Like if you give clear, specific pieces of communication and then they show up and do it and you're like, hey, I noticed you remembered. I really appreciate it. Generally, this is the space that DAs really flower into interdependence. This tends to be the place that they like show up, they want to make an effort, they hear you, they see that it's like possible. One of the biggest places that DAs tend to get stuck on things is when they don't know what it looks like. I remember having this conversation with a couple and they were like a fairly young couple. And they had just had their first child and the male was a DA and his wife was, she was FA, but she had a lot of like secure in her too. She was like an FA, but had done a lot of work. And I remember him saying to me, cause she was like talking about how she had expressed her needs and how he hadn't really tried to meet them. And I remember him saying to me, well, I'm afraid I'm going to do it wrong. And I just don't know how. And she was there at the time in the session. And I remember she was like really shocked, like, you feel like you don't know how? And he was like, yeah, like I need you to kind of spell it out for me. And he was like embarrassed to say that. And you could tell he actually felt a little bit of shame around it. And he was like, I need you to show me like specifically what that's supposed to look like. Like if you say you need time together, like what are we supposed to be doing? Like, how do you need me to like show up during that time? And he had so many questions. And I remember for me as a counselor, I remember thinking, like, okay, like probably so many DAs are feeling this way and don't feel safe to express it because they feel ashamed about it because they shame themselves so easily, even though that's not a situation worthy of feeling ashamed. Like it's not like they're doing something shameful, but it's their programming. And so, when I actually came to start asking after that, a lot of DAs like, do you really know what that looks like? Countless times I would hear things like, I don't know if I'm cut out for these kinds of things. I don't really understand my emotions or how I'm supposed to be sometimes. I feel like I'm incapable. Like they have a lot of sort of self-defeating, limiting beliefs about who they are in relationships. And so making space to dialogue that out, to get really clear, really specific, chunk needs down, make them really simple at the early stages, right? Because remember too, like a lot of you guys in here, if you're DAs yourself, you've probably done a lot of work already. So you might be in a different sort of space, but for the loved ones of people in here who are DAs who haven't done any work yet, they really need to start like from baseline, right? Like really clear, specific, simple. And when it feels like that, it also feels achievable. And I'll give you one other hack on this. Dismissive avoidance, because they tend to have like lowered emotional bandwidth, because they're like really repressing their emotions and because they're usually living in a bit of a state of like dysregulated nervous system mode all the time. Often what happens too is when you ask for something from a DA, I know I mentioned this a few webinars back, but when you ask for something from a DA, try to give it like a time period. So it doesn't feel like if you're like, hey, I need more presence during our dates, like presence with a C, not like gifts. If you're like, I need more presence during our time together, or if you're like, I need, whatever your need is, um, if you can say, for the first 15 minutes, or if you're like, I need more time together, right? Sometimes a DA, and I've had many dialogues with DAs over the years and sort of seen the inside of their lives, in counseling sessions. And usually DAs will say things like, they want more time together. Like, how much time will be enough? Like, what if they want to spend all the time with me? I never get time alone to myself. And like, those are the fears. But if you say something like, hey, like, I want to spend an extra 2 hours a week together, or I want to spend an extra, when we spend time together on a Saturday, let's start at 2 hours earlier, or let's, when you give like very specific tangibles, it helps the DA not hear your request as like, I'm going to be codependent and taken over and lose the relationship to myself. When they hear like specific time periods, it's like, oh, okay, that's a solvable problem. I can do that. So it gives them a lot of like hope when appealing to trying to get your needs met as well. So anyway, so those are some like high level kind of things to start off with.